right, everybody, thank you for coming. Welcome to Plans on the Planet with John Levy and Courtney Bender and Chelsea Spencer. I'm Lucia Alais, I'm the director of the Bureau. Today's event, just as a reminder, the Abundance series started about 2 years ago to turn our attention to, as you can see, the cornucopianism that's being built in this graphic. And specifically the role that architecture plays in contributing to this myth of abundance, by which I mean the promise of nature's boundlessness, the guarantee of political freedom, economic opportunity that has tended to go along with it in the American imagination. And we've been especially interested in the way that architecture helps, or proves to be especially helpful when this myth has to be reinvented, when the moments when the limits of territory or of abundance become evident. Architecture is a resource which helps to renew it, and so the theme began as a way to look at moments like the mid-19th century when buildings like these helped to renew the idea that architecture could quote-unquote make the land pay. But if we started with buildings like these in the middle of the 19th century, which were kind of like, very on the ground of making landed resources pay, the two speakers we have today will show us that this plan never ended and that architects continued in the 20th century to be recruited to this plan of making the limitlessness of the earth present again. So whether it's of natural resources, I'm going to switch today, whether it's to transcend the limits of the earth in the sense of the natural resources or of its kind of pedestrian nature, we have to transcend the earth because it's too pedestrian and bureaucratic. These two speakers today have not only found amazing archives and episodes in which this task of architecture continues well into modernist and postmodernist architecture, but have found extremely canonical figures to talk about this with. And there's nothing more rewarding when you know a series theme has been fruitful when, first of all, canonical figures come to be folded in, and also at the hand of scholars who are not inside our field, and who maybe take these figures more seriously than we architectural historians do. So you'll hear of some Frank Lloyd Wrights and some Philip Johnsons in ways that is completely unexpected today. So maybe not Wrights today.
No.
Maybe some Moses and some.
There's some
things. So today's event takes place on the planet, Plans on the Planet, in 20th century U.S. cities, and planning is the activity that renders a new planetary limitlessness possible. Although, as you'll hear in both papers, whether the word planning is the right word to designate the design practices that we'll hear about is, up for question. So we'll first hear from Courtney Bender, who is the Ada Byron Brampton Tremaine Professor in the Department of Religion at Columbia. She has written several books, including The New Metaphysicals, Heaven's Kitchen, and has co-edited a number of volumes as well. Our second speaker will be Jonathan Levy, who is professor of history at Sciences Po in Paris. He is the author of, I don't know this one, The Real Economy, History and Theory, Ages of American Capitalism, and Freaks of Fortune, as well as many articles which are on the syllabi of many students in this room. And the response will be by our very own Chelsea Spencer, who is currently the Buell Postdoctoral Fellow, working on a book drawn from a dissertation titled The Contract, the Contractor, and the Capitalization of American Build. So please help me, join me in welcoming Courtney Bender.
Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm writing a book about the future of religion, and a very specific future that was imagined and shaped and sometimes built by modern designers in the American 20th century. Like John, who I thought he was going to go first, so I thought I would be following him in this statement, I am not an urban planner and I am not an architectural historian. But as a scholar of American religion, I've come to observe that through the 20th century, modern American designers, often understood by themselves and others as either indifferent to religion and certainly as secular professionals, that they were often made responsible for giving spatial and material form to an image of a new religious possibility that many believed, many outside their field believed, was taking shape within the American modern. So their work, as I'm arguing in this book, made a type of religious future visible and moreover present in the US in material form and through practices of seeing and expression. So today I'm going to take you to one chapter of this book, which will not include discussion of Frank Lloyd Wright or Philip Johnson.
I'm sorry.
Apologies. I'm sure none of you are sad about that, actually, or others. We'll take you instead to this place, which is the Fair of the Future, Your World of Tomorrow, the New York World's Fair 1939-1940 in Flushing, Queens. This was, as the language of the day said, a civilizing force. Or to quote, sounding a note of peace and goodwill at a time when many sections of the world are sunk in a welter of brutishness and savagery, the New York World's Fair will seek to spread among men a deeper sense of the relationships of the nations, a more abiding purpose for understanding and advancement. This was a plan on a planet that was heading to war, a plan for unity and peace. It was a rather Pyrrhic project. Where was religion at this fair? Well, this was a question that many people were asking in New York City and beyond. Many of them sounded a little bit like one of New York City's most famous Protestant ministers at the time, Norman Vincent Peale, who reported to his congregation, and his sermon was then reported on in the Times, that he had been to the fairgrounds and he had been to the main theme exhibit. You see an image of it here, and there was no religion to be seen. The point was echoed by the Times reporter and by others. There was good reason to expect, they thought, that this world arising in Queens, designed by the modernists looking to the future, would not have any religion in it. But the designers of the fair were in fact quite interested in religion and the spiritual aspirations and even the souls of modern citizens. To see this, however, we need to go beyond a familiar scale of thinking about religion or even a familiar understanding of religion. One where religion is not visible in the ways that we might expect, where it's emergent rather than present, and in fact emergent anew and profoundly within modern social life. This idea of religion was actually quite atmospherically present in the 1920s and 1930s. I will just give you one exemplar of this, published importantly in 1935, the philosopher John Dewey's book, A Common Faith, which went through about 20 different republications in the years around the war, where he makes out an important distinction, or he captures this distinction. There is a difference between religion, a religion, and the religious. And he was very keen on the religious, which he understood as being in some ways universal, natural to humanity, and also immanent in the world, but nonetheless religious. And this idea, this understanding that he had, that he was speaking about, he says, compels us to ask what conception of unseen powers our relations to them would be consonant with the best achievements and aspirations of the present. This idea, and this is the important lines here, demands that in imagination we wipe the slate clean and start afresh by asking, what would be the idea of the unseen, of the matter of its control over us, and the ways in which reverence and obedience would be manifested if whatever is basically religious in experience had the opportunity to express itself free from all historical encumbrances? This was an idea that coursed through the fair's planning. I track it in this voluminous archive, actually, in the language of many of the principal designers of the fair, who include people like Robert Cohn, who was the head of the Board of Design, an architect and urban planner, along with designers including Stephen Voorhees, William Dorwin Teague, Walter Harrison, architect, Henry Dreyfuss, Clarence Stein, and others. I track this in minutes, in memos, and in press statements. Now, the roles of these modern designers, as they understood it, was not to make religion itself, but rather it was something rather more ambitious, if a little bit more inchoate. They viewed the fair in its entirety, I believe, as a project that could orient a citizenry and a public toward the proper affective orientation of this future, a more spiritual future. And so their role was to bring about a space, a clean, slated space, to start afresh, to allow a spiritual sentiment unencumbered by various human differences to unfurl. Now, let's be clear. The New York World's Fair, like all fairs, was one that was primarily a commercial endeavor. These were sites to entertain people and to enrich certain people, to show off merchandise and technology, and to promote national causes. The New York's Fair was certainly no exception to this. Planned during the Great Depression as a make-work activity, it would come to employ tens of thousands of New Yorkers. an entire city would rise up and then 5 years later be completely dismantled, and in its place would be Flushing Meadows Park and later Arthur Ashe Stadium. The corporation was formed and set up shop. It set up shop in offices. This was the sight line from the offices at the Empire State Building, and you can see the World's Fair there in the distance. In this enormous, so the fair was, I think, really, just to remind myself, about politics. It was about labor, it was about spectacle. There was really nothing that the fair wasn't about. But within this enormous morass, two aspects of the fair's construction help me highlight these spiritual vibes. One was the ways that the fairgrounds in Flushing, Queens were discussed and described by the fair itself. And Robert Moses really got into this, he's our key dude here. The fairgrounds, as usual, it's New York, right? So the fairgrounds in Flushing that were to become the fairgrounds were mostly already public lands in the 1930s, but they were dumping grounds and junkyards. There were mountains of coal ash and junk to be cleared away. In The Great Gatsby, there's this great scene, this description of this ash heap. But in this process of clearing away, a modern and future place would arise. Robert Moses had taken the opportunity to reclaim and actually to literally build a new land from these marshlands. These were understood by the fair and expressed as land that didn't have any history to it. It was like just terra nova. But also, as we see in this language that comes from one of the fair's many press releases, that the uplift of this land out of the morass, out of the darkness, out of the swamp, was a chance to reclaim from darkness incorrect forces in the world, including, as we see this very interestingly laden language of the witchcraft, or the witch doctors, pointing a better way for all mankind. So, a future city taking place on a space without a history, not burdened by past organizational structures or outdated needs. In the center of this fair would be an organizational structure organized in this Fair of the Future manifesto that was proposed by Lewis Mumford and about 100 other very self-important modernists of New York City at the City Club in 1935. This document actually would become the unofficial template for the fair's Board of Design. They proposed an organizational structure of the fair around 9 sectors. And these sectors for the fair centered the human. The life of the human, so they proposed, would be organized around human needs rather than machines or mechanics or technology, as many forms were. The list here in 1935, as you see, includes religion. It also doesn't include the air industry or any other thing like this. So let me show you very quickly how this worked in the design imagination. And this is going to be very quick. So from this list of 9, the sectors were then elaborated on, and I apologize, this is not a better image. This is an enormous document like this, and hasn't yet been digitized by the New York Public Library. So you see an elaboration of the design imagination here of these sectors. And from this, about 5 months later, this is mapped into a diagram where you see the theme in the center and the government ahead, and comforts and communication, and off to the side you see amusement and entertainment. I'll note that this in the prior one is at the bottom, so recreation and amusement at the bottom. It's moved off to the side now. And then this diagram becomes the fair. So so it just sort of becomes the actual fair. So it just sort of imprints on. And amusement's sort of over on the other side. It's sort of the not really nice part of the fair. It's not really the future, so it's across the highway to catch it through only this one little bridge that goes over. But the fair really wanted the fair designers really wanted the fair to be represented in this abstraction. So what we see in the fair really is this as an elaboration of an abstraction, an expression of a kind of interconnection, the lifting up of interconnected human needs into which the visitor would enter and then move from one sector to another. So such was also the plans for the individual sectors like religion. So each of the sectors was designed to be in two parts. It was supposed to have a variety of things of today around, and in the middle, the future was supposed to arise. Here we see what would have been the comprehensive coordinated exhibit of religion, which was going to express in a clear and dramatic way the possibilities of development for the future of religion. Surrounding which would be a number of different types of religious iterations, different denominations with different types of chapels. This concept was developed in religion. This is the interior of this building. This is conceived by Clarence Stein and two of his Protestant and a Catholic and a Jewish architect. It's a very important trio in this time. So the concept was developed so that the central building or tower would represent the new religious impulse that would permeate the whole of our American people. At the center and standing as a testament to them all, an empty glowing tower. This initial design described as an open auditorium flooded with light from abstract stained glass windows. And very importantly, was not supposed to have a single religious object in it. That was part of the past. The ground floor was to feature an open concourse with arches opening at each of the cardinal points, suggesting free-flowing movement and connection. The fair planners, the Board of Design, actually also approved a variance so that the religion exhibit building could rise to the second tallest building in the fair after the enormous Trilon, that pointy building. Twice as tall as any other building at the fair. It was, in fact, the model sector in the fair, or at least that was the plan, and John D. Rockefeller Jr. pledged $25,000 towards its building. But it was not enough to see interconnection on the ground. The interconnections of modernity also needed to be seen and, more importantly, sensed and felt in a larger way, in a larger kind of whole. This was the 20th century. Airplanes were flying around. The fair decided that the observation deck was a little bit old hat. After all, the Eiffel Tower had already been done. So the Board of Design decided to put the fair's theme exhibition into the Perisphere, and to provide us a view of the future from a much higher, if simulated, place. So inside the Perisphere, the Board of Design mounted the fair's theme ride, which they called Democracy. The entire ride was to offer an experience of seeing the future from an airplane, as if from an airplane 2 miles up. While its balconies were magic carpets, sometimes described this way, Henry Dreyfuss, who was the designer, was intent on making the sensational experience one of what it would actually feel like to be aloft 2 miles up, something that very few Americans had experienced in 1939. He proposed, although it did not come about, a single rotating balcony suspended high in the Perisphere globe in a very largely darkened arena that would provide an uncanny sensation. He knew from experience that there would be little to see from such a height, not much beyond outlines and patterns. But in those patterns, he could convey the movement of good ideas between sections and the breaking down of fences, as he said, that now wall us in. In this panorama, to quote, will be representation of the interdependence of various groups, cities, states, and nations, of urban and rural peoples, and the story of a nation's rise to greater power by reason of this recognition. Dreyfuss actually concentrated most of his attention in the sky. He assigned the design of this diorama, as you see it, to a junior colleague, asking only for a typical garden city to show highways linking small, self-sustaining towns to a center city, all of which were ringed with manufacturing and agriculture areas. Most of the model buildings in the diorama were, in fact, I think, designed by the Diorama Corporation of America. I love this, that there was a Diorama Corporation of America, and they lacked any distinctive details. On its opening day, Dreyfuss's Democracy was unveiled as visitors stepped out onto this platform, as beams of morning sunlight began to break gently over a darkened landscape, announcing the beginning of a new day in the life of this interconnected city. As the sun began, and then they would describe this, the day in the life of Centerton, and then as the sun began to set on Democracy, the strain of the fair's anthem, A Rising Tide by the Black composer William Grant Still, began to swell. Soon from this darkness, another group appeared in the sky. You sort of see this here, men and women marching, singing their triumph, the true symbol of the world of tomorrow. They have triumphed over chaos. They have built the world of tomorrow. The lights continued to glow until the spectators were, quote, enclosed in a great glittering iridescent bubble, giving the sensation of being engulfed in the symbolic dawn of infinite space. This project was beset by all kinds of political and technical challenges. The moving balconies, the lighting effects in film and sound all worked on different motorized. So the motorized timers didn't work, the future didn't look all that coordinated, and people tried instead then to think about this world below. Why couldn't they see it? And Dreyfus said very clearly, we are not in the business of city planning. Indeed, they were not in the business of city planning. They were instead in the business of orienting a public towards a future that was not yet present, toward a horizon of newly visible, perhaps flickering so, unified world. The purpose was to inspire a gasp on the part of the audience and to bring them into the position where they could take up this new world and the new spirituality it afforded. But the demands of the public to see religion meant that before the end of the fair's first year, photographers went and took pictures of the tiny little objects that were in this diorama, this panorama. And one of them was this poor little building that became known as the Religion Building. So to answer appeal, yes, there was a church. They pointed, in fact, to this little building, but wincingly so. This was not the religion of the future that they hoped anyone would imagine. It was, in fact, too Christian. If you can see, this is a cross on the top. They also pointed to something, but I should say that by the end of the 1940 year at the fair's designers had decided to shine a bright spotlight on this building because of the shifting politics and the onset of the war. On the ground, the politics of religion and religious pluralities and unity had played out in another and not surprising way. The soaring tower of religion that was to guide the way in the fairgrounds was deemed to be way too expensive, and in fact, nobody wanted to pay for the religion of the future to be built. Its open portals were likewise closed and within a cloisters, shutting out religious others that the Board of Design deemed it too strange to be part of the religious plurality of the future. A patriotic phrase was pasted over the lintel, which made the Board of Designers sort of abjectly depressed. The entire thing, in the end, looked like a Depression-era post office crossed with the Lincoln Memorial. Not a modern glory here. So, anyway, in this project Buell Project of Abundance, thinking about how building, infrastructure, surveying, and related disciplines make land available for ownership and exploitation in the Americas, I think that I would say that the modern designers at the fair, much that they were doing, was spiritualizing this abundant project. In planning, in landscape, in a pedagogical project that carried through the fair, that spiritualized abundance. It took its skyborne. It was, I think, in this way is also dependent on a certain kind of petroleum world that is, I'll gesture to, is coming in. Its failures were also absolute. The failures of the Temple of Religion, the failures of the diorama. E.B. White, writing for the New Yorker, said that at the fair, that temporary and exalted feeling of being in the presence of something pretty special, something full of aspiration, something which at times was even exciting, nonetheless left him without a sense of what it all meant, or even how it came together. To be informative about the fair is a task for someone with a steadier nose than mine, he said. So, anyway, looking at this fantastical moment and its failures, I think it's important to notice at the end, nonetheless, the Dreyfus did not think that they were in the business of planning cities, but rather of orienting souls. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to everyone who facilitated my visit. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a particular pleasure because in the room today are two of my finest former undergraduates from the University of Chicago. I also want to thank Courtney for beginning by taking the words out of my mouth, which is that I'm not qualified to talk about architecture in any way, shape, or form. I'm barely qualified to talk about the history of cities. I'm not an urbanist, I'm a historian of the economy, but I am writing a book about the history of Houston, and that's what I'm going to speak about in my remarks today. Houston, a Scottish businessman, noting the chaotic and sprawling pattern of the city's development. Once called Houston the place where a traveler can no longer rationalize or explain what he sees. So instead of a kind of modern triumph over chaos, this is a place where chaos triumphs over you. Rayner Banham, not Lewis Mumford, but Rayner Banham, visiting Houston in 1978, which is the year that we're about to head to, remarked that compared to Houston, where there is infamously no municipal zoning, and, quote, property wheels and deals have less restriction than anywhere else in the world, that Los Angeles in the Chinatown epoch seems like a socialist economy. But Banham continued, I'm still quoting him, no movie like Chinatown will ever come out of the guts of Houston, because Houston has no native grown culture with which to explain itself to the world. Houston has no history with which to explain itself to itself. So Houston has no history, which I think is another way of saying that you can't rationalize what you see or you experience there. I think we can learn something new and important by attempting to make sense of the city of Houston. I also think there's an urgency to do so that concerns climate change and the relation between its history and politics. Remarkably, I think in hindsight, the same era that witnessed the scientific confirmation of anthropogenic climate change, the first political efforts to mitigate it, the fastest growing city in the United States was Houston, a city premised upon the global oil economy, as I'm sure many of you know, a city with, this is the petrochemical complex in Houston, and a city that has a per capita energy consumption higher than anywhere else in the world, except for maybe Phoenix. It's always kind of a race with Phoenix. This is just a map of what was built after 1945, so you can see the newness of the city too. This is kind of early air conditioning. I have a chapter on air conditioning in the book, and certainly I think or have thought of Houston as, in many respects, the next frontier in the history of abundance and land use that has been a theme of the project that brought us all here. So Houston represents both the cause, but also a consequence of a way of life that's now faded toward the planet. And Houston, simply because of oil, even things that do not directly address climate change, nonetheless are always about climate change in some sense. So I think it's a city that lives with climate change, and we could say, going backwards, always has. This is during Hurricane Harvey, around the corner of the house where I grew up. So kind of how have people lived with climate change, even if they didn't know they were doing so, is the kind of central historical question I want to pose to the city. And I also think that if you don't have a politics for Houston, for what to do with a place like this, you don't really have a politics for climate change. This is related to history and historical consciousness, because if you can't narrate the history of the city can't tell its own history, and I don't think it can have a politics about this issue. So this raises the question of scale, which is really the issue I'm grappling with most in trying to write this book. At which scale to most effectively write this history? Planet, climate, globe, region, city, freeway, capitalism all come to mind. Which themes or processes beyond just CO2 emissions themselves are at stake and relevant across all those many scales? But what about starting from a building? And so what I want to do now is talk about one building in Houston, and that is Transco Tower. You can see there on the left. Upon completion in 1983, celebrated as the tallest skyscraper outside a downtown. I don't know if that category ever existed, but here it is, the tallest skyscraper outside a central business district. And you can see what lied beyond Transco when it was built here in 1983. I took this photo last year when I was in Houston But I do recall growing up in Houston, a sense of kind of spatial disorientation, given the diffused character of the city's sprawl. But it was true that driving around the city, especially the west part of the city where Transco is, that more so than a downtown skyline or any other kind of markers, you kind of did orient yourself by looking at Transco and seeing it as a fixed point. Speaking of kind of photography and its importance to both our talks today, this was a book published in '86 called Presence. Just presence. They just took photographs of Transco from around the city, just so you can see it. Transco was elemental to the completion in Houston by 1983, when the building was completed. At the end of the city's great 1970s boom, the greatest boom in the history of the city, a distinctive kind of urban form, a mixed-use conglomeration. It's really not native to Houston. Houston doesn't invent it. It's already been theorized in many respects. But arguably, it was perfected in Houston, and then subsequently, by the end of the 20th century, truly went global. So can the history of Transco Tower help explain itself in Houston to itself in the world? So let me now give that a try. Transco was developed by Heinz Interests. This is Gerald Heinz. Heinz founded the firm in 1957, became during the 70s the largest developer in Houston before it went global. In the 80s, it became what it is today, the largest privately owned global real estate development company. There's some scholarship on Heinz. Much of it is good, but 2 years ago, an unusually capable Chicago sociology PhD student that I collaborate with, his name is Joshua Silver, who's writing a dissertation about contemporary energy politics in Houston. He kind of talked his way into Heinz, and before anybody noticed, photographed a large portion of its company records before they were destroyed in a move. So that's what I'm drawing from today. Heinz was born in Gary, Indiana, a U.S. steel company town. His father worked in the steel factory. He earned an engineering degree from Purdue, and to find work he moved to Houston in 1948, and he began his career as an air conditioning salesman to commercial buildings. In '57, Heinz's office was in a former residential home converted into commercial office space because Houston has no zoning laws. It has no municipal city planning. Land use in Houston is governed by property law, but also deed restrictions. A tax code too, and certainly markets. In 1976, the director of city planning, they do have an office of city planning, wrote to new hires in the department in an internal memo that, quote, the city plan is published every 10 years and is designed to be of interest to those who plan private development. So Heinz, is planning the right word? It's the word Heinz used, like he used that word. I think he did plan a lot of Houston. I can talk about Heinz if you like. He's not a good guy. He's not a bad guy. I think he's just, someone. This is Heinz's memo that they wrote for Northeastern and European investors, where it tries to explain, what the city is like. And it says, unlike major American cities, Houston has relatively few municipal zoning ordinances. Heinz has the red pen, and you can see him right there. It has none. The memo continues, traditionally cities develop in a progression of urban to suburban to country, with the urban area containing the majority of business activity, the suburban and country areas containing mostly residential and retail areas. Because of the freedom from zoning in Houston, this has never strictly occurred. He writes not true, because the 50s actually, it does kind of have a urban form like that. And then in the 70s it becomes something different, much because of Heinz. Free from zoning laws, Heinz started in the 50s and 60s to build west of the downtown area through a residential neighborhood. And he just did it. A lot of these buildings I quite like. And the key was figuring out the air conditioning. That was the key. And Heinz was good at that. He had a very good air conditioning designer. His name was I.A. Naiman. Heinz was involved. These are all kind of Transco documents. In building Transco, they talk about planning. They plan parking. They plan traffic patterns. around the building. They also planned green spaces. This is private. It's owned by Heinz, but it's kind of one of the few green spaces that exist in Houston, certainly in this area. It became kind of appropriated as a public park, even though it's a private space. The economic side, the finance comes from Northeastern life insurance companies who are struggling with inflation. This is the sort of financial story I can talk about if you like. German banks, Deutsche Bank, they invested a lot of U.S. property in the 70s and 80s, including Trump. And then the planning involved leasing the building. I mean, this is highly speculative construction, given that there's basically kind of nothing there on this site besides what Heinz has already built, and then also involved a lot of publicity and marketing, which I'll come back to in a second. Heinz's speculation was that Houston's future would be defined by a logic of mixed use, developments that mix commercial office space, residence, shopping, dining, hotels all together, while mixing spatially the very idea of a city's center and periphery. Houston, earned the nickname Space City because in 1958 the federal government chose to locate NASA in Houston. This is the big blue marble photograph sent back to Houston and NASA. But it's also true that Houston's Space City, I think, because the production of economic value in the city is not organized around increasing industrial productivity across time, but rather creating economic value across space. And there's certainly no collective or public planning of the city's future, and so rapid real estate development across space discloses the city's future. Indeed, the largeness of Houston, its past so recent and shallow, concerned space, not time. Now, as the local saying goes, the city breathes in and breathes out. During the 70s, Houston's greatest decade of growth, the population roughly doubled from 1.4 to 2.75 million. But as that happened, the city actually lost density. Density declined and remained about half of Los Angeles. Transco was leapfrog development. Heinz built at what in the late 1970s was a kind of western edge of the city. He bypasses space to the east between the Transco site and Houston's putative downtown. And he developed kind of land in between, so that's kind of the breathing out. And then later, the breathing in, some of the city gets filled in kind of on the kind of internal space between the downtown area and where Heinz had developed on what was then the Western Fringe, although it's now considered the city's center. Now, secretly in the 60s, Heinz first began to buy kind of large blocks of property where a new city loop freeway ran at the confluence of three freeways. This is a plan. This was the original post-war freeway system planned by the county. It's kind of classic post-war modernist. The freeway system ignored the ecological logic of the city's network of bayous in which the water runs from west to east from prairies that were west of the city. Most of those prairies have now been destroyed, to the Houston Ship Channel in the east, where all the petrochemical complex is, through a dredged part of Buffalo Bayou, east of downtown, that drains into, eventually, the Gulf of Mexico. In the 60s, to cope with flooding from tropical storms and hurricanes, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers channelized every major bayou in Houston to try to move rainwater faster out of the city and stop the flooding. Another kind of high modernist project. So these are the kind of main bayous that, again, run west to east and completely conflict with the spatial pattern of the freeways. This is an example of channelized bayou. This is the bayou, Brays Bayou, that I have a chapter on in the book. It's the bayou that I grew up next to. This is what it looked like before channelization. However, the channelization of the city's main bayou, Buffalo Bayou, which ran north of the Transco site, east to downtown, its channelization was blocked by local environmentalists. This is the 60s, in the richest residential neighborhoods of Houston, aided by a young Texas congressman named George H.W. Bush. So they blocked the channelization and they blocked development along Buffalo Bayou. This made the Transco site, here it is before Transco was built, It's along the freeway loop. It's a kind of choke point because of the protection of Buffalo Bayou. So much of the city's traffic got routed around directly past the Transco site on what's called, this loop is called 610, the 610 loop. So by the 80s, it's the most, has the highest, the most traffic, it's the most used stretch of freeway in the city. Again, not the downtown area where all the freeways funnel, but this stretch. And Hines, he foresaw that. He figured that out. Aerial views. You can see this kind of confluence of freeways that runs by Transco today. Aerial views of the site before development. First, to anchor it, he's going to build, or he did build, a giant indoor air-conditioned shopping mall, which he called the Galleria, off the Galleria in Milan. There's the Galleria of Houston on the right. It's got a skating rink inside. Don't laugh. Don't laugh at Houston. A series of low-slug commercial office buildings followed. I can laugh, though. Rented by leading oil service firms, Bechtel, Exxon, residential complex, hotel, retail stores, restaurants. And so now the stage is set for the 64-story tall Transco Tower. And for Transco, Hines chose Philip Johnson, who'd worked with Hines before. There they are together. The most canonical building that they built was a 76 Pennzoil Place. Now Johnson, Big Johnson, happily mused to Gerald Hines on his inspiration for Transco, and I'll quote, "Perhaps the creative seeds were gathered," now you have to laugh, "perhaps the creative seeds were gathered from the wheat fields of the northern plains of France. The cathedral was at first only a hazy silhouette on the horizon, but as you get closer it evolves." Johnson continued, he's imagining a chateau. "The cathedral functions in the manner of a bell tower in a traditional Italian town square, but it goes beyond that because it is above all a testimony to Christian faith." And Johnson continued that Transco was part of a, excuse me, that slide's out of order, a new tradition, a new history of monumental building that connected to that Christian past. The question becomes, what was Transco a monument to? What faith? Now, Transco was developed, actually that is the right slide, through a partnership between Hines' interest in the Transco Corporation, the Transcontinental Gas Pipeline Company, a corporation that had developed a 10,000-mile interstate transmission pipeline system extending from the Gulf of Mexico through South Texas to New York City. It's still operational today. There you can see it, and Transco is also very important to offshore, creating offshore kind of natural gas pipelines. You can see this is now what the Gulf of Mexico, the bed of the Gulf of Mexico looks like in terms of the gas line pipelines. Actually, the old Humble Oil, it's a Rockefeller interest, became Exxon. It operates the largest oil refining and petrochemical complex in the U.S. in a city called Baytown, Texas, which is east of Houston, which I'm also writing a chapter about. The Humble Oil pipeline ran underneath Hines' Transco development. It's one of the reasons why the property was cheap. Humble had an easement that Hines had to have his lawyers kind of manipulate and work through, and they eventually re-encased the pipeline with concrete so it wouldn't blow up into a pipeline fire, as they're known. So this is like a pipeline fire from last year. These happen a lot. Not a lot in Houston, I don't want to be too dramatic, but they do happen where a pipeline just explodes. So a monument to a faith in fossil fuels. A monument to real estate speculation. Hines did build Transco in 81 to 83, built it very quickly. At the height of the Volcker interest rate shock, a steep worldwide economic depression, in which, crazily, I think, Hines speculated he could occupy 100,000 square meters of commercial real estate in a new 64-story tower. Hines is deceased. I haven't spoken to him, but I've talked to a lot of people who worked on the project, and they were extremely nervous that this would be a bust. But they leased enough space, building it rapidly and occupying the lower half, actually before the top half was finished. To market the space, which became very important in this endeavor, Heinz created a massive kind of publicity campaign to sell the image and presence, that's the word they use, of Transco Tower, drawing from Johnson's musings on the building, which he was more than happy to provide. This is also presence. Yeah. And then this is, people already occupied the bottom of the building while they're still finishing the top. Okay. So this is a memo that Heinz wrote, drawing from Johnson's letter, describing his vision for Transco, that they used to kind of market the building to potential renters, really, but also the city at large. It was a public event, the construction of this building. I'll quote, "Transco is a symbol, but what does it represent? How did it come to be, and what does it mean? Transco is a vision of a mysterious future, speculative and awesome, rising about the present reality as a truly visionary proposition. Its unprecedented presence allows the beholder to read into it any number of associative readings. Therefore, it can be understood, but its distance from an immediate experience is also a necessary disassociation, which allows a flexible reading to sustain any number of possible symbolic connections. Transco contains, after all, virtually nothing. Transco, the very symbol of Houston, it speaks about an endless future of a city yet to become." So Transco then is a monument not to oil or real estate, but to nothing. Right? Transco contains nothing, or at least a monument to disassociation and the possibility of a plethora of associative readings that amount to virtually nothing. I'm quoting again, "Not memory about things past, but an urban amnesia waiting for a future." So that's the best Houston could do in 1983 in terms of narrating itself to itself in the world. Bannon would love this, an urban amnesia waiting for a future. Let me conclude now with just a few points. Transco was the last act of this great spurt of development in Houston during the 1970s when oil prices had skyrocketed. It's a symbol of a high energy, low density, automobile-based form of urban life. Even while being completed, because of the oil Volcker interest rate shock, oil prices plummeted and the city fell into a steep economic depression from which it did not recover until the mid-1980s. Furthermore, while Houston always flooded, the year 1979, the year that Heinz started building Transco, saw massive floods, which it was recognized then, really for the first time. Other people knew, but it really enters into the public consciousness of the city. The floods were caused by a kind of urban development that had led to more runoff and relied upon the modernist notion that you could ignore the ecology of the city, especially its bayous, simply by channeling the bayous and moving the water out as fast as you could. So this late 70s, early 80s moment, just before the outbreak of climate change in public consciousness and public debate, this moment for the city, a serious debate about what kind of future development it should have, a debate about transportation, a debate about floods and flood control, a debate about zonings. Zoning law almost passed in the late 80s, but it didn't. To make a long story short, when the city began to grow again in the mid 80s, it would just grow, the same way. And then also mid 80s forward, Heinz during that downturn after Transco, he actually stopped building in Houston, and his pattern of development in his own company went global. It often followed Middle East and Russian kind of oil and gas connections. This is Heinz in 2024, their kind of global operations. I'm just going to race through this very quickly because I want to stop. They start in the Middle East, they start in Russia, they start in Mexico. After '89, Heinz is law firm is Baker Botts. And Baker is James Baker. So there's no question that the firm had connections into Eastern Europe and Russia through James Baker, although I don't think I'll be able to find much evidence to really elaborate that argument, but that's sort of known. The 90s, 2000s, they start to move into Western Europe. I do have, this is in Russia, I do have a lot on this project in Milan that they built north of the train station in Milan. So I can talk about this, if you like. This is the most recent development in Paris, and they built a lot in China in the 2000s, but those records I haven't been able to get, access to in any way, shape, or form. So I don't have a strong kind of causation story for Heinz, or kind of as Houston goes, the world goes. Like I'm not interested in making that kind of argument. I don't think it could be sustained. But there certainly is a kind of globalization of the kind of urban form that appears early on in Houston and then begins to appear throughout the world more generally. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Lucia, for inviting me to respond to these both really rich papers. I teach in this room, so it's weird to see it
Not
reorganized. I usually sit over there. So yeah, it's really nice to be here as part of the duo. And thank you to Courtney and John for sharing your work with me. It's really interesting to read. So since we're in the habit of reciting our qualifications, I'm also not qualified to talk about these things. I'm, not in the business of the 20th century anymore, but I did live in Houston last year, and I have been to Queens at least twice, so I can offer that. So I have some kind of general reflections that have questions embedded in them. You can take them up if you wish, or we can take questions from the audience. But so from what I got from these two papers, there's emerges two seeming enigmas. On the one hand, there's the religion or the world of the future in 1939, and then the history of Houston since, say, 1973. And both are evidently bewildering and kind of banal, illegible, and perhaps also thoroughly mystified. Both very much in need of histories, which is why these two projects are so welcome. And in each case, I would maybe argue that they involve spectacle. So that's what I want to talk about first. This is more obvious in the case of the World's Fair. So there we find these planners of the World's Fair in 1939 fretting over how to kind of simulate this spiritual sensation of the world of tomorrow in general without revealing their deep uncertainties about its particulars. The way they try to do that and manage this tension in the Democracy, is that how you say that? Exhibition is through so many kind of sleights of hand, I would say. So fairgoers are placed in this diorama world where they are kept constantly in motion by means of this moving walkway that rings the sphere and apparently sometimes breaks down, but in any case. And so they're kind of placed in orbit around this world of tomorrow, and also into a kind of time lapse. So there's a full day that is projected with the lighting that's compressed into just a few minutes. So we have this kind of orbiting around this world and then also this time lapse. But also rather than look at the city below, fairgoers are constantly being reoriented to the sky to look above. And then we could maybe go back to that image. It's really extraordinary, the kind of people sitting in the clouds looking almost deceased and kind of reborn. So interestingly, fairgoers asked to look up, don't look down by any means. And I think the aim, as Courtney tells us, was to provide a really true sensation of being airborne, the idea of flying. But I think we could also read this as placing visitors in some sort of cosmic relationship with the world of tomorrow. This is a view from above, and in the longer paper, Courtney describes this as they have in mind this kind of rational, comprehensive understanding that this will give fairgoers, but it's also this godlike view, very kind of in the clouds, it's not like higher than that. So my first kind of general planetary question for Courtney is, how did fairgoers, how did the planners want fairgoers to really see their relationship to the planet, to the world? It is a sphere that they're in, but they're kind of inside the sphere. It's very strange geometry. And with all these very deliberate attempts to direct attention toward the sky, this gaze over the world of tomorrow without like looking directly at it, what were people being asked not to look at? Certainly this sort of being in the business of orienting without looking directly at something presents a lot of spatial complications. Okay, so whereas fairgoers in New York in 1939 are orbiting, sent into orbit by the planners, the city of Houston becomes known as Space City, this kind of sprawling home of NASA's mission control, where government employees were tasked with sending men into outer space. But despite this kind of clear named identity, Space City, we're repeatedly told by Reyner Banham, among others, in so many words that Houston, as John tells us, has no culture, has no history. And on that subject, I cannot resist mentioning that the phrase that has become so famous from the Apollo 13 mission, Houston, we have a problem, is actually a misquotation. It was, Houston, we've had a problem, past tense. So in our cultural memory, we can't even seem to remember that Houston has ever had some kind of past, even a past tense. So my question for John is the notion that Houston has no history simply because it truly confounds our historical narratives? Is that the reason? Or is this urban amnesia waiting for a future a more deliberate production, a kind of sleight of hand in the way that it's visualized in Courtney's paper? And I'll tell another story, which is in my time in Houston, I kept hearing these radio ads they're for the power companies, and they're always trying to get you to buy more power. And they would have this specific deal that's like the total inversion of what you would find here, where during peak hours, there's like a certain plan where you can use as much energy as you want. And so they explain this, or they sell this by saying, summers are getting hotter. But they don't explain like what that means. And so there's this weird management of living with climate change without being aware of it. So I'm really intrigued by that. I wrote down postmodernism. So maybe we can talk about that later. But I will say that Jameson, describes this crisis of historicity as really a structuring condition of postmodernism. He uses the Bonaventure Hotel in LA as his sort of allegorical representation of this. So when we're thinking about Hines, I think we could also think about him in this cultural context. And so I have a lot of unprocessed thoughts and feelings about Houston, but what was really distinctive and quite shocking to me about the city was not the car-centered and air-conditioned urbanism that I knew to expect when I moved there. It was the real material presence of the oil and gas industry in the city, and the way the whole place is absolutely haunted by climate catastrophe, not only in the future, but also in the past, and also kind of perennially. In New York, we can kind of pretend that we forgot about our dependence on oil because of this Transco pipeline, but in Houston, it's more of an effort to ignore it. So one example is the whole city is sinking because oil and gas companies in the beginning of the 20th century pumped so much groundwater out of the earth that it subsided as much as 10 feet in some areas. This produced a kind of landmark property law case, which I'll save for later. So the air conditioner and the automobile aside, Houston probably wouldn't exist but for two specific events at the turn of the 20th century. So that's the discovery of oil at Spindletop, very close by in 1901, and just as importantly, the Great Storm of 1900, which is still the deadliest natural disaster in US history. And it destroyed the quite prosperous city of Galveston, which is kind of on, right on the bay outside of Houston. And so when Galveston is destroyed, a lot of people move inland. So Houston for me was this place that really feels haunted again by both the past and by the future. you live in Houston a kind of suspension, not unlike the suspension that I think the fair planners are trying to simulate. Gramsci would maybe call it the living in the time of monsters, when the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. So the sense of suspension is palpable in the 1939 World's Fair too, but not in the dreamy, airborne way that the fair planners hoped for, I think. They seem completely unable to escape the past, even when they think they're being at most futuristic. So they reject the kind of tower as a way to look down on things. And despite their breathless insistence on novelty, both the content that is being displayed, this sort of typical garden city as specified, and the technology of its presentation, the diorama, are 19th century inventions. The diorama in particular was quite an old technology. It was created in 1822 by Daguerre, so it precedes photography. And interestingly, the last diorama that Daguerre made is in a parish church outside of. Yeah. So I just want to end by kind of thinking about this category of the planetary, and this event has been framed around this term in comparison to, say, the global, the world, or even the mondial. So planetary, the etymology is about wandering, and it's not really it sort of eclipses global, I think, in around the time of the space race. And Alyssa Battistoni's new book called Free Gifts, which is about how capitalism kind of depends on the seeming abundant regeneration of nature. She proposes the term planet making to describe the kind of multi-species activities that are more than world making. So in both of these cases, we have, I think, instances of either world making, in the case of the World's Fair, quite literally world making, as in any fair, and then in Houston, a kind of refusal to world make. But we can. That's maybe another question: is there a kind of refusal of this type of representation? But in either case, they are doing nonetheless a kind of unconscious planet making. And in Battistoni's book, she calls on us to do conscious planet making. So my final question is just, how do we think about these projects of world making or refusal of world making in relationship to planet making, whether unconscious or conscious? And then I have other things about wasteland and speculation, but I'll save it for now.
All right, thank you.
Well, there's too much to say, but so thank you. I want to talk with Will HLC. So I think, well, just to stress I think that there's James Scott sort of has got us all perpetually thinking that when we go up, it's supposed to look down. There's supposed to be sort of mastery over the place, or that the world on view is sort of inculcates, or there's an expectation of the introduction of you go up so you can master that. And what is really interesting in many of the cases in this and in my book too is how you can't see what's down there, right? I mean, it's another sort of type of mastery or imagination, but it is not one that's actually coordinated with the world as it might appear to us. And so so the critique I didn't read in or discuss, but one of the critiques of the Perisphere was that it was dream stuff, right? So that it was in fact too dreamy. They were just they were creating this dream world, and that I do think that that's just a pretty solid critique in the sense that the World's Fair people, when they were doing this, were trying to get people to dream of some world that they, not planet, but certainly some world that they could inhabit. And so if they were to see a relationship to the planet, it was that the planet was actually pretty bad, right? I mean, it was really that, and so that there was in fact a need. Yes, and there was a need. There was a need to remind the masses of the world, right, that there was a possibility of some other way. And now I think this is bananas, but in terms of what they tried to do, and certainly their imagination of how to do this outstripped the technological possibilities of the materials that they had to actually affect it in this, right? So So it's not surprising that Dreyfus spent like all his time, he spent like a year and a half trying to get the lights coordinated with the motion of these balconies so that it would all come together, and it just like really never worked, right? So, just so sad. But it's also, I mean, I think that there's also, one of the things that they're trying to do is to try to show, I mean, I was thinking, John, about yours, like there's thinking about what infrastructure is visible and not visible, and like how do we imagine the world or the planet or whichever that we're in relation to what is or is not actually made visible or sort of socially understood as visible. So, you know, the power lines in the World's Fair, they were like not out and strung up. This was all like underground. So it was like this Arcadian like place that was lit up, but it didn't, like even something as simple as power lines that remind you that you're in the world, right? That is out there in the rest of Queens, right? Was different in the fair. And so, you know, is like the tunnel, like the tunnels, all of the pipelines that are invisible to us in New York, but not to you in Houston, right? This idea of, but then their idea about what bringing other kinds of infrastructures, what they understood to be human infrastructures, into visibility, right? The sort of connectivity. It's also Gary, right? Right. I think that's. I catch them. I don't think they succeeded, and I think that, you know, we don't think like them, but it's hard to see what they were trying to do, I think. One other thing I think is interesting, then I'll pass it to John, is that Dreyfus in this, he refused to let people take pictures of the inside of it after it sort of started getting made. So, because he wanted the spectacle to actually like be real. Like he didn't want people to have a pre-image of it. And the consequence of all of the things in the entire World's Fair that we do not actually have pictures of working, it is this, right? We have images like this, so it also sort of slips into this like archive of, or this absent archive. It is itself a thing that is, so are you supposed to see that diorama? He thought no. He actually was like, do not let people look at that diorama. They made a little book where he told that really ugly little building, right? Where, but that was, you know, on demand, and he hated it. You know, the visibility of things was really a matter for him. So anyway, that's all I have for now, but so much there, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you too. Maybe just a few brief remarks. I mean, I'm resisting now terms like postmodernism, even modernism, post-industrial, in terms of framing this project. I mean, it's odd to think of Houston as many people have as a kind of emblematic postmodern and post-industrial city because of how important the oil economy is to industry and industrial modernity. And so on the one hand, I kind of see maybe more continuity across this period than a lot of kind of meta-historical narratives of the late 20th century, you know, would insist. I mean, I think it does indicate that those narratives ignored the kind of ecology and environment and energy, right? That's kind of part of the problem why people in the 70s, 80s go to Houston and they don't understand it. Well, there's the petrochemical complex, like here are the pipelines, like don't you see how that's connected to the larger project of industrial modernity? So part of what I want to do, or at least where I'm at, the phase I'm at in the project now is to try to just immerse myself in the archive and just look at it and try to figure out what it is on its own terms, you know, without appealing to sophisticated categories of analysis or anything like that. I mean, I do think, with all that said, I'll now contradict myself, that Houston's an interesting place to look to understand the late 20th century because a lot of the interpretive anchors we use, which really have to do with the post-war period, a kind of post-war era that's industrial or the New Deal order or it's social democratic or it's modern, like it never existed. Like it never existed there. So we can't appeal to it to understand what it is. You know, we have to make sense of it on its own terms. That leads to your next question: is why is it so difficult? Why is it so hard then? Why do people struggle so much to do it? Yeah, sort of two thoughts here. One, I think, goes in the direction that you were suggesting, Chelsea, which is definitely right. That it's a city developed by, that exists for private interests, whether it's oil or whether it's real estate development. And they have an interest in constructing their own narratives, which might be confounding for quite cynical reasons, or at least self-interested reasons, that they want to continue to develop the city in the manner that they choose, which requires there not being kind of public narratives for what the city is. That might lead to things like control, regulation, planning that would, disrupt the city that they want to build. With that said, I do think, and I don't have my own categories or my own kind of meta narratives, or my own necessarily kind of analytically honed account of Houston yet. Hopefully, I will someday. But it is striking, or has been striking to me, this '80s moment when the city busts, and there's a debate about how we're going to develop it in the future. And Houston elects rather progressive, liberal Democrat as mayor. Her name is Kathy Whitmire. And the first thing she does is say, we're going to have zoning. And they hire a bunch of consultants from Boston and Chicago who come in and say, this is not a city. Let's tell you what a city is. You got to have this, got to look like this. And they're wrong. In the sense of it's striking their inability to look at the city and figure it out, and then come up with a kind of public narrative, or at least a narrative that a public can contribute to chart the direction of the city, and to appropriate it, give it its existing form, as opposed to imposing very abstract notions of what a city should be onto it. And so I'm more and more thinking of the book as a failure of liberalism to really reimagine itself in the late 20th century, because it's stuck on a lot of hang-ups that prevent it from seeing what's in its face, And so I think of writing this history as trying to do that first and foremost, which is really a precondition of imagining a more public narrative for the city. I mean, John Dewey also wrote a book called The Public and Its Problems, where he said there's many publics, but publics have to constitute. And in many respects, the failure of the city to have a history, or to have had a history, is the failure for a public to have constituted. It might still. I think it could still happen, and even now, I'm more optimistic than I would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. But not in this moment. Not in this period.
Okay. We should take questions, and I'm going to take privileges of the introducer. First of all, thank you so much for bringing this amateur amateur interpretations of architecture to us. Courtney, to your point about whether this is too infrastructural, does it look too much like practical infrastructure? In the written chapter, you describe, I guess, this moment where it's behind John's head, where I guess Dreyfus is upset that they want that escalator to become 2 lanes, and that he thinks that that's too much like a real escalator, and he wants it to be very thin.
Right.
And then similarly, does it rotate?
Yeah, it does.
It's stacked, it's actually 2 of them. So there is a very, very fine line, I guess, between designing something which is actually quantitative, which is technologically demonstrates its wonder. But then the third layer is the one where there's not those people up in the clouds, they're not actually on an actual escalator. So it seems like the main design problem is not even whether to render infrastructure visible or not, is exactly how to design it, and it's probably a very fine line between something that seems pedestrian, like a line, or like an escalator you would see at Macy's or something, versus this escalator, which is totally different, which means that you're going into another world or something like that.
So yes, so it was supposed to be 1 escalator and 1 circling balcony, right? And it was supposed to be higher up. And those people up there are actually projections. Those are not actual.
Yes, I know.
Okay, yes. So it's just supposed to be 1, and they said we can't make money on this if it's just 1.
Right.
This is exactly what they said, right? So this is like the failure of modernism, at least from the outside of your field, right? This is where do you put the cigarette machines, whatever, you still have to make money in the building. So, but right, so this very fine line, the struggle, the struggle of this entire affair to put forward its own image of what the future
Yeah.
could be. I mean, I think going back, why is the diorama used? Why are these things? I'm maybe not, I'm just ripping on your comment,
no,
but I'm
that's
not.
exactly right. But
Okay.
because in the paper you also have, and you make a slight comment here about how they say, oh, this is fairs as they've always existed. And I'm, as an architectural historian, thinking like, what, 1850s? But no, they mean fairs like medieval
They
fairs.
do.
So that's a pretty secular commercial activity. So do they imagine that that's also somehow a religiously infused event? Is it the religion of the everyday, or is this? I mean,
This is a new use for a fair, right? So they understand this modern moment as moving the fair from its
I see.
earlier, and doing this other thing, right? And that's also why the strong hand of their design project was very much like these guys were they tried to be at every meeting, and in the 2,500 boxes that are at the New York Public Library that tell you the story of the fair, right? You can see in granular detail how each of these projects was undone by commerce or undone by politics. So thinking about just one sort of factotum or tiny story, so that they were going to put that big temple of religion, empty building there, and they were around it. They were going to put all of these different religious groups that they were going to have their own little chapels, but they only had 5 spots, and the first 3, just like that, the people who were in charge of leasing these 5 spots, they let them be to the Christian Scientists, to the Jewish Palestine Committee, and the YMCA. So there was no space for Catholics. There was really no space left for like the special Protestants that they thought should really be there. Like there was the leasing agency, the business side had like let out all of this, unfurled this all these like crazy religions that didn't really belong in the fair, right? And so they actually had to retool what this middle building would do, right? And so the sort of tension between the commerce and design, is just, it undoes religion, it undoes everything here, and yes, so I'm sorry.
That's good.
Yeah.
I have a similar comment for John. I really like the way you're using the word scale and monument, or our words. You didn't use scale so much here, but methodologically you're saying at what scale does one tell the history of this very abstract phenomenon? And then in monument, but in both cases you're resisting, it seems, the very banal definition of scale and monument, which is that something that has a reference. It's a monument to something, or it's a scale of something that you can then expand. And instead you constantly tell us, well, no, actually, it's a scale, but it's not that therefore it expanded outward or duplicated. But you did say monument to dissociation, which seems a pretty accurate depiction of the scalar or spatial, gesture post-80s and globalization. So could that not be somehow, that's not a reference, I'm not saying it's to dissociation we all know, but it does seem like something that would also have a spatial quality to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's certainly there, and I haven't, it's in the archive, I haven't quite, I think, although I haven't quite gone through, everything yet. It's surprising to me, given what I know about Houston in the 70s and the early 80s, how quickly they became a global operation. And so something has to explain that. And so you're right, they must have already, he and 4 or 5 other people that were essentially running the company and making those decisions, there was already something going on where they were thinking in kind of, perhaps global terms that a building like this represented to them. I'm still surprised that they couldn't come up with a better marketing campaign, right? That they didn't actually say this is a monument to even something really banal or silly, like, the free enterprise in Houston, right? That they kind of, in the end, kind of come up with this nothingness.
And they were basing it on Johnson's words?
A lot of it, yeah.
That's
But,
why,
but that's Heinz too. Like Heinz was very, no one else in Houston was paying and hiring, famous architects. And he's doing it to design the buildings, but also because he wants that publicity. And so Heinz does have a need and desire to be a sophisticated person who can narrate what he's doing to the city and also the world outside the city. Whereas most people who are developers in Houston do not have that, at all. And so that makes him, unique. And the disassociation, I think, is right. I think that is actually how people experience this building. So there actually was a kind of honesty to what they ended up, coming up with. But it's still nonetheless, I think, striking that they couldn't do better.
I actually think, though, that saying that it's a narcotic beacon,
That's pretty good.
searching for its ultimate meaning within collective consciousness
Yeah.
is like a pretty fine
That's
Yeah.
good.
line.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
straight from you.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's go from the
That's
narcotics to the
Johnson.
room.
Yeah. No,
Take a question?
it's not
It's
Johnson.
it's in the memo.
It's Heinz.
It is
It's
in
on
there,
too,
yeah.
Questions from the room?
I thought I did the last one.
Mhm.
No questions whatsoever. It was all very clear. Matt?
Thank you both so much. So I was curious about the relationship between speculation and planning in both of your projects, because I mean, kind of in both of them, both here and also in the case of the tower in Houston, it seems like speculation sort of like plays the role of sort of refusing to define some kind of future direction or shape in which the future would hold. Either in this case, the city, which they're sort of not interested in planning, or also for Houston, the sort of like larger decision not to adopt any kind of planning regulations, but to instead let the market speculatively work free form to sort of shape the city. So I sort of wonder if, like that connection is something that you see operative in your projects, and if it sort of gestures towards some of the sort of wider role that either this fair installation or the tower kind of play as objects acting within this kind of like history that's forever in advance.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You go first, John.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you're right to suggest there's kind of two meanings to speculation. One is there's this very kind of cultural register, very abstract notion of the future. It's imaginative, it's creative, and they're sort of playing with that term and that kind of cultural register to conceive the building and think about its place in the city's trajectory. And then there's the planning kind of dimension of it, and they call it speculative office space. I put up the memo to their financiers, but the amount of planning that went into the building in terms of projecting what kind of demand there would be to lease is striking. There's a lot of it. They were doing essentially kind of demographic and economic surveys of the west side of the city, which had developed rapidly in the 70s, that the city wasn't doing. They hired consultants to do it, and so it's Heinz. It's not the city. It's not the municipality, and it's not the county that develops, that has the knowledge, that has the capacity to project in which direction the city is going to grow, to understand how the freeways and the roads are being built, and to figure out if in 3 years anybody will rent office space in this building or not. It's still speculative because it's uncertain and it's oriented towards the future. But nonetheless, I mean, I think planning is the right word. And with Heinz,
Like this kind of document you're saying?
yeah, that's for a Northeastern life insurance company. But with Heinz, like, and this is the company, and this was him. I mean, I think his contribution to it. They're very interested in having a sophisticated cultural narrative of the company and its buildings. But at the same time, like, it's a very serious planning operation through and through.
When this speculative space makes me think of an earlier chapter in my book, which is about skyscraper churches, and the role and in that reading, I guess this is not news to any of you, but how skyscrapers were imagined, like each floor could be its own world, right? So that the speculative space has another sort of register, which is that there could be something new on each floor without any relation to the other floors that actually existed, and the ways that in the early 20th century anyway, that or in New York certainly, that like the frontier was like up. There was like infinite number of like worlds that could be just like raised into the sky. In the skyscraper churches, of course, all the churches were in the basement, so they didn't really like make it up into this this aerial place. But right, I think that it's a really good question. I'm really struck by the. I think that one of the design problem that these guys were thinking about, or one of them, was that they sort of had an idea of like how they could design things to make it better, but like, you know, like most people in the world like didn't agree with them, right? This is like, you know, these are, you know, or didn't care, or, you know, or actually had different views on what the plan for the planet should be, right? So the sort of to put, like, how could they put people in alignment with their plans, right? Or participate within them. This had to be sort of a world plan, right? So this like these speculative spaces were ones where they were really strong. They really did. It was imaginary, right? They didn't want to tell you what religion would look like, but they wanted to put you in an orientation so that you would agree with them about what religion should look like. So this is a, you know, it was a very sort of like, it was a very pedagogical project. And I think that it, well, anyway, I guess maybe that's, I don't think there was, I think there was a lot of spectacle. I don't think there was a lot of speculation. But yeah.
I might just, so isn't the central building called the theme building?
Yeah.
Like they won't even commit to a specific theme, you know? That's like a very speculative gesture.
Right, and they, you know, people ask them like what the Trilon and the Perisphere, like these buildings, what they mean, and they were like, they have no meaning, they are just abstract forms,
Yeah.
right? And there were like thousands of people.
Yes.
Most of their letters are still in the archives. They're saying like, this is what the meanings of these buildings are. You're like, tell us what they are, right? So
There's something similar in both places, actually.
yeah. So this is like this
It's
narcotic
Jonathan saying it's not, it doesn't mean anything.
because it's just like this, right?
But I think, like, I'll really take this, I think this is, I'll really take this, I'll take your idea and put it into this project, this sort of orientation. I think that's really important. And, you know, Jameson's whole point is you can't orient yourself in space. Like, that's what postmodernity is. And with Transco, it's the opposite idea. Like, this is actually going to be a way that people can have presence and orient themselves in the city.
There's a book called Presence.
Yeah,
But
it's a
just
book called
one thing about speculation though, Courtney, is that also
Okay.
it's not just whether it's market or, you know, rock commerce versus elevated religion, just the qualitative keeps pushing in. So even with the religions, it's like, it's gonna be 3 religions, that sounds good, but then it's like, they're all Christian, I guess? So that's not really.
Protestant, Catholic, Jewish.
Okay, so, yeah.
But they're writing on magic carpet.
But again, there's this question of if you can count it, then it's too
It's too
concrete.
Yeah.
So it's not just abstract versus specific,
Right.
it's like, there's a countingness that comes up.
Yes, but one of course can't. I mean, it's like right. It's precisely the problem. Like you have to count or can't.
Last
Right.
Sure, actually following up on Matt's comment, because I wonder if that distinction, or to me that distinction between speculation and planning also stems from this myth that the market was not planned. Like the market is something that is natural, that Mont Pelerin had not, like the liberal thought is something that just kind of emerges without kind of being forced into a system. And so I wonder if this like claim to the monument of nothing is also like kind of doing the work of not desanctifying the market, right? Like retaining it as this like thing that is still kind of like you cannot talk about, you cannot kind of point to and say it is a monument to the market. And so I think that's what the role of religion also is doing in your project.
I'll just say briefly, it's a terrific remark, and I think you're right, that they're calling it planning, but the monument to nothing is they don't want to avow just how much the city is being planned. And I think the reason why you know that's right is, as you can probably imagine, a lot of the little guy developers in Houston that are caught up in the market, a market that Hines very much shaped, they hate Hines, right? I mean, they see him as you know, someone who's planning the city and is exerting political power and using the city and using the county and inhibiting the kind of open kind of market transactions that you know, are mythologized by the city's politics and ideology.
Nikolai, last question, unless somebody has a burning.
Thank you both so much for these presentations that to some degree I'd say they're both about nothing. And it seems to me...
We just like to insult our speakers. Amateurs who spoke about nothing.
It seems to be that both presentations in a certain way point towards these, for lack of a better word, empty signifiers in which there is a gesture toward the monument, towards this project that in its nebulousness, still there's work, there's labor being done, there's still construction happening in both projects, and there's a certain fussiness or arbitrariness to both of them that enable finances to be circulated into the prospect of market to circulate within it. And my more specific question in parts for Courtney, I was really taken aback about the fact that no one seemed to want to finance this main church, and holding the knowledge that one of the principal holders of land in New York City are churches, Trinity Church, etc. It seems to me, at least through this project, that there's a hesitancy, there's a wariness. I'm not sure what the gesture is towards both acknowledging, like Heinz, like there's this, let's just say, big bad guy or this big project, and yet the nothingness, the absence of something, rather still evokes an effective quality pushback. Where are the other actors? I think for John, how are these other like smaller developers? How is Houston outside of Heinz seeing Heinz develop the city? It seems to me like the nothing is surprisingly scary. It's doing a lot.
So let me say that, if I can say briefly, that well, I would imagine that you probably agree with me that religion is not nothing.
Yeah.
But just in general. So there were plenty of people who were very, very excited to finance religion, meaning their religion, but to finance the abstract religion, or the religion that was sort of connecting all of them, or this futuristic religious that was not religion. It was not easy to get people to fund that. But they nonetheless did build a building, and the consequence of that was that it became a building that was Protestant Catholic Jewish, and it was in fact the first in the U.S. anyway building where Protestants, Catholics, and Jewish people saw themselves as being in the same space. And there were many actors in this period who, there was the National Council of Catholics and Jews that had started in the 1920s that were also involved in building this sort of connections between the three groups. So while the world of this sort of not counting religion, the religious, did not really manifest, what did manifest in the fair was a very concrete plan and bricks and mortar plan for Protestant, Catholic, Jewish Tri-Faith America that then went out into the military. It was, extended to the airports. It extended in many other fairs, right? This and in our literature and our sort of imaginaries. So there was a real making of religion there, but it was not the one that anyone who was building the fair really wanted. This is also a story of that kind of thing too. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
Very, very briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So with Transco, there's sort of two separate comments that I think follow from your question. With Transco, Heinz used union labor, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he used union labor to build Transco. He really had no choice because he had to build it so fast. Interest rates were going up so quickly that he basically was pay them whatever they want. It's better to pay them higher wages than to delay construction and have it come out of making higher interest rate payments. When it opens in '83, the American Federation of Labor has a huge organizing campaign in Houston that fails. And so the building trades, also in industry too, union labor, this is happening everywhere in the United States at that time, is really crushed in '83. And Heinz, he did use union labor. He could have monument to unionized labor. He didn't say that, so that's sort of telling. And then second, on the flightiness and the nothingness, I think the last chapter of the book's going to be about Enron. This energy company in the late '90s that, talk about flights of fancy from the infrastructure of energy and oil is all about celebrating derivatives and the kind of financialization of energy flows. And so there is something happening in the city. There's a lot of fraud too. But that's part of, the fraud is kind of part of how the city gets built in the 60s and 70s too. There is something happening in the history of the city that culminates in Enron with just a complete flight of fancy from the kind of infrastructure. And I think Chelsea you're absolutely right about the city now, that the kind of, it's visible climate change and energy, but that's a 21st century history of the city. In the 90s, actually, was precisely the opposite.
All right, well, going on those flights of fancy, thank you so much, and thank you.